The wind howled low across the barren plains of Rusted Gulch, a forgotten town clinging to life at the edge of the Wild West. It wasn't much more than a cluster of wooden buildings, dust-covered roads, and a saloon that had seen better days. Most folks here walked with a chip on their shoulder and a gun on their hip. The law was more of a suggestion than a presence. In a place like this, weakness wasn't pitied, it was preyed upon. Into this dry, bitter corner of the frontier road. Caleb Rourke. His hat was pulled low, shadowing eyes dulled by grief. He wore his pain like his worn duster, tattered, dusty, and quiet. Once, Caleb had been one of the most respected ranchers west of the Cimarron River. They said he could rope a steer blindfolded and shoot a rattler from 20 paces. Back then, he ran a sprawling ranch with his younger brother Jesse, and together they were legends in the making. But legends don't last long in the Wild West. A range war over water rights had erupted between the Rourke brothers and a rival rancher named Judd Carter, a ruthless man with more hired guns than cattle. Jesse had been gunned down and the chaos left to die in a dry creek bed while Caleb fought for their land. When the dust finally settled, the Rourke ranch was burned to ash, their cattle stolen or slaughtered, and Caleb left standing alone among the charred remains of his family's legacy. Caleb was a ghost of himself, drifting from town to town with nothing but a battered horse, a rusted Colt revolver, and the hollow ache of guilt. He didn't speak much. He didn't drink, not because he was righteous, but because even whiskey couldn't dull the ache in his chest. People avoided him. Not out of fear, but because grief had carved him hollow, and there was something unsettling about a man who no longer had anything to lose. In Rusted Gulch, he found no welcome, just weary glances and muttered whispers. They called him the Hollow Hand or the Walking Shade. Some claimed he had gone mad. Others figured he was just waiting to die. He spent his nights at the corner of the saloon, never ordering more than one coffee, black, bitter, and hot. The locals took turns trying to pry stories from him or provoke him into a fight, but Caleb never rose to the bait. He just sat, silent, staring at the dust dancing in shafts of light. Like memories he couldn't touch. Then came the night that changed everything. The saloon was louder than usual drunken laughter, echoing off the cracked walls as poker chips clinked and banjos played off-key. Judd Carter happened to be in town, seated at the center table, playing cards with his usual band of bootlickers. He spotted Caleb across the room and sneered. "What's the matter, Rourke?" He called out loud enough for the room to hush. "Still sulking like a whipped dog? Or are you just waiting for someone to put you out of your misery?" Caleb didn't answer. Didn't even blink. That only egged Judd on. He signaled to a wiry man at the door, who stepped outside and returned, moments later pushing a rickety wooden cart. In it sat a young woman no older than 25. Her hair was long but unkempt, her dress faded. Her legs lay motionless beneath her, and her arms rested stiffly on her lap. Her face was pale, but her eyes sparked with fury and shame. "Here's Eliza May," Judd announced. "She ain't got much use below the waist. Some Eastern dandy's daughter broke her spine in a carriage tumble. Family dumped her off like a broken crate. I figured, why waste her? Maybe our cowboy needs some company." Laughter erupted loud, cruel, and echoing. It was meant to be a final insult. A joke. Give the ghost of a man the ghost of a woman. A pair of broken things for everyone to laugh at. But Caleb stood slowly. He walked across the saloon floor without a word. No one moved, too stunned by what might happen. He stopped at the cart, looked Eliza in the eyes. She didn't blink. Her chin tilted upward, defiant even in helplessness. Caleb turned to Judd and spoke his first words in weeks. "She's worth more than any of you." Then he picked up the cart handles and pushed her out into the night. The laughter stopped, and just like that, a new story began, not of jokes or pity, but of two discarded souls who would soon make history. The prairie air was sharp and cold as Caleb Rourke pushed the cart through the darkened streets of Rusted Gulch. The old wooden wheels creaked with each bump and rut, protesting the rough journey out of town. The sky above was a dome of indigo, scattered with stars that seemed to shimmer with quiet judgment. In the cart sat Eliza May, stiff and silent. The laughter from the saloon still echoed in her ears. Her pride had already been bruised by fate, but tonight it had been crushed under the boot of cruelty. Paralyzed from the waist down, she had long since grown used to being pitied. But this being given away like some unwanted trinket in a twisted joke was a new kind of humiliation. She hated him. Not the cowboy, though she didn't trust him either, but all men like Judd Carter who saw brokenness as entertainment. And if this Caleb Rourke thought he was saving her, well, she wasn't about to be grateful. They reached the edge of town and turned onto a dirt path, the cart bumping violently. Caleb's old cabin sat on a patch of dry land near the tree line, half collapsed, roof patchy and porch boards warped with time. It looked like no one had lived there for years, and in many ways that was true. Caleb had returned weeks ago, but had only managed to restore one room to livable condition. He didn't speak as he opened the door and carefully lifted Eliza from the cart. Despite her thin frame, she was no light burden. He carried her gently, not as something fragile, but as something respected. It was subtle, but she noticed. He laid her down on a narrow cot in the corner, draped in a clean blanket, and then, without a word, set about lighting the fireplace. The room slowly filled with flickering warmth and the scent of cedar smoke. Still, she said nothing. Neither did he. For a long time, the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was simply the quiet that follows a storm. Caleb offered her a tin mug of warm broth and a bite of bread, but she refused. Her jaw was clenched, her gaze distant. He didn't push. That night, Eliza lay awake on the cot, listening to the night sounds, the fire crackling low, the wind moaning through the slats, and the gentle scrape of Caleb moving about tending the horse, gathering firewood, repairing something outside. Every now and then she heard him cough low and gravelly, like a man who had swallowed too much dust and sorrow. She wanted to believe he had some angle, pity, guilt, maybe just loneliness. But whatever it was, she refused to be some broken souls. Redemption. Her body didn't work the way it once did, but her mind, her will, they were intact and they were fierce. When morning came, Caleb placed a tin cup of clean water beside her and nodded. "I'll be fixing the fence," he said simply. His voice was gravel and wind. She said nothing. He didn't seem to mind. Days passed. Then a week. Caleb didn't ask her questions. He didn't treat her like glass, but he never dismissed her either. Every morning he left her water, bread, sometimes beans or stew if he had time to cook. Every night he stoked the fire, repaired a window, or worked by lamplight mending tools. Eliza, for her part, stayed silent. But her eyes followed him now. She noticed how he always removed his boots before entering, how he worked long after sundown with no one watching, how he set her cup down carefully, the handle always turned toward her good hand. And slowly, without either of them realizing, a silent pact began to form. Caleb began crafting a chair pieces of old wagon wheels, smooth planks, and iron fittings. Eliza watched him from her cot, frowning, until the shape began to take form, a chair with large wheels, a device that might let her move again on her own. He said nothing about it, just built it in the corner as if it were always meant to be there. Then one evening, as he worked in silence and she watched from the firelight, her voice broke through the quiet like thunder in a dry sky. "Why?" Caleb looked up from his tools. His hands stilled. For a long moment he said nothing, then quietly answered, "Because no one should be thrown away." Eliza blinked hard and looked back into the fire. That night, she took her first sip of the broth. It wasn't gratitude. Not yet, but it was a beginning. The wind softened in the coming weeks, and so did the silence. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a nod from Caleb in the morning when he handed Eliza her water. A single thanks from Eliza when he adjusted the blanket without being asked. But like spring following a long, bitter winter, something subtle and essential began to shift between them. They didn't talk much, but they no longer needed to. This was the silent pact, an unspoken agreement formed not out of words, but out of mutual respect, dignity, and something even rarer in the Wild West, patience. Caleb finished the wheelchair. It was crude, built from scraps and hand-forged metal, but it worked. The wheels turned. The seat was sturdy. The footrest sat wide enough for Eliza's legs, still limp and motionless. He wheeled it into the room without a word, parked it beside her cot, and walked away like it was nothing. Eliza stared at it for hours that day. The next morning she asked, "Will it roll on dirt?" Caleb shrugged. "It'll try," she gave. A soft snort, the closest she'd come to a smile. With Caleb's help, Eliza was slowly lifted into the chair. Her hands gripped the wheels. They shook. Her arms were weak. She hadn't used them for anything but feeding herself in over a year. But determination burned in her eyes like gunpowder. Waiting for a spark, she wheeled forward, just a foot. Then another. It was clumsy and slow, but it was freedom. From the corner of the room, Caleb watched, hands stuffed in his coat pockets, saying nothing. But his jaw tightened, and his eyes betrayed a flicker of something soft pride. Maybe. Outside, the prairie had begun to bloom in spring's reluctant warmth. Wildflowers poked out through patches of dry grass. Caleb guided her chair outside, down the porch ramp he'd quietly built one morning before she woke. Eliza wheeled herself onto the dry, hard-packed path and inhaled deeply. The sky seemed bigger. When you could move again, the days settled into quiet rhythm. Caleb tended to the homestead fencing, patching the roof, splitting logs, and Eliza watched him while learning to maneuver the chair inch by inch. Sometimes he'd find her by the fence, hands on the rough rails, staring out over the empty field. "I used to ride horses," she said one afternoon. Fast, like wind, he glanced at her. "Still can, maybe." She didn't answer, but her eyes lit up for the first time since he'd met her. One rainy evening, Eliza found an old, dusty crate of books beneath the floorboards, leftovers from the days Caleb's mother used to read by the fire. She brushed off the covers, almanacs, medical notes, a poetry book, and a half-torn Bible. She stacked them on the small table beside her cot. "You read?" she asked him. He shook his head. "Never learned much beyond signs and cattle brands." "So?" She read aloud. Not often, not dramatically. Just a page here and there, at first to herself, but loud enough for him to hear across the room. Her voice, once bitter and sharp, softened with the poetry. At night, her words drifted into the corners of the cabin like smoke, gentle, slow, and oddly comforting. And Caleb listened. Every single word. One night by the fire, Eliza finally asked what no one dared. "How did your brother die?" Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Trying to save land that wasn't worth dying for." She watched his face in the firelight, saw the ghosts hiding behind his eyes. He looked older when he talked about Jesse, not in age, just in sorrow. "I was supposed to protect him," Caleb muttered. "I didn't." Eliza reached out and placed her hand on his. It was thin and pale, but steady. "You're not the only one who lost something," she whispered. "But you're still here. That means something." He didn't respond, but he didn't pull his hand away. By the time summer rolled in, the cabin was no longer a husk, it was a home. Caleb built a proper ramp, fitted the outhouse with a privacy rig for Eliza, and even found a second-hand harmonica. She liked to fumble with at dusk. She painted a makeshift curtain with berries and charcoal. He found old wildflower seeds and planted them along the fence. It wasn't grand. It wasn't easy, but it was theirs. And somewhere in the silence between the unasked questions, the quiet gestures, and the soft way they said each other's names, they had made a promise, unspoken but firm. Neither would walk away. They had been given to each other as a joke. But they stayed together by choice. That was the difference, and it would soon make all the difference in the world. The prairie had a way of healing slowly, just like people. Summer came with sun-scorched mornings and whispering winds. Days stretched long, and though the land was still dry and harsh, the cabin by the tree line no longer felt abandoned. It breathed again, just as its two unlikely inhabitants were learning to do. Eliza May, once locked inside a paralyzed body, and colder silence, now wheeled herself around with growing confidence. The wheelchair Caleb had built rolled easier now. Its wheels had worn into the packed dirt, smoothing the trails between the porch, the garden patch, and the edge of the field where wildflowers fought for space. Her arms grew stronger by the day. Her hands, once soft and trembling, were now calloused from gripping the wheels and tools. She was no longer a figure lying helpless on a cot. She was moving, creating, living, and that life didn't just grow from her body, it grew from her mind. She read for hours each day, old medical books, anatomy sketches, herbal field guides, left behind by Caleb's mother. When Caleb cut himself on a rusted nail one morning, Eliza took over. She wheeled to the table, crushed herbs from the backfield into a thick green paste, and wrapped the wound with linen soaked in her homemade salve. 3 days later, the wound was clean and healing. Caleb said nothing, but from that day on, when he or his horse were hurt, he came to her without question. One late afternoon, Caleb brought home a pair of sick chickens from the trading post. "Won't make it through the week," he muttered. "Man sold 'em cheap." Eliza examined them carefully, feverish, listless, their eyes dull. She brewed a solution from pine sap, garlic, and water boiled over the hearth. With a dropper made from a hollowed reed, she fed the birds by hand. They survived. After that, word spread quietly at first. A rancher's wife came asking about a goat that wouldn't eat. A trapper with a fevered dog showed up next. And just like that, the woman no one believed in became something different. The healer on the hill. Caleb watched it all unfold with quiet awe. He was no stranger to labor. He built fences, hauled lumber, and rebuilt the barn with his bare hands. But what Eliza was building was something deeper. Hope. People came not just for cures, but for company. They stayed for tea. They asked about the books, the herbs, the wind chimes she made from bent spoons. And they saw something Caleb had seen first, back in that cruel saloon night. She was never weak. They had just never looked past the chair. And Caleb? He changed too. He shaved regularly now, fixed his old coat. He stopped looking at the ground when he entered the general store. He began bartering again, tools, furs, eggs for paper, nails, and things Eliza needed. Most importantly, he smiled again. Not often. But it happened. When Eliza read him poetry by lantern light, when the chickens chased her wheelchair like rowdy children, when the first flower in their garden bloomed, he let himself smile. And sometimes even laughed out one evening while repairing the porch steps. Caleb looked up and asked softly, "You ever miss the city?" Eliza, picking chamomile from her herb box, blinked. "Not a day," she said. "Only miss writing and ... sing." Caleb paused. "You used to dance?" She smiled. Like no one was watching, he tilted his head. "Then maybe we'll dance again someday." She looked at him long and full of something more than gratitude. "Maybe we already are," she whispered. The land didn't grow fast, but it was changing. So were they. The patch of prairie around the cabin turned green with herbs, flowers, and life. Caleb built a wooden sign for the gate, May House. Eliza protested. "It's your home, not mine." He shook his head. "It's ours." Yours gave it back its name. They had lost everything, family, movement, reputation. But together, without even saying it aloud, they had made something greater. A new life, a new purpose. A home not built from lumber, but from respect, shared silence, and tiny, growing dreams. They weren't just surviving now, they were living. The wind had changed. It no longer howled across the plains with emptiness. It sang, low and soft like a lullaby humming through the tall grasses. And in the cabin now known as May House, something else began to sing too. Eliza May had found her hands, her strength, her purpose. Now, slowly but surely, she was finding her voice. It began with a letter. One morning, Eliza wheeled herself to the small wooden desk Caleb had built for her. She dipped a feather into an old ink bottle and wrote carefully, slowly, each stroke deliberate. Her fingers weren't as steady as before the accident, but her mind was sharper than ever. The letter was to Dr. Miriam Hall, a physician who had once mentored Eliza back in Boston, before the accident, before the fall from society, before her name became a whisper of pity in drawing rooms. In the letter, Eliza did not complain about her condition. She did not dwell on the cruelty that had brought her to this dusty edge of the world. Instead, she wrote about her herbs, her healing trials, and how she had begun helping animals and children in the nearby ranches. She signed it boldly, Eliza May, Prairie Healer, Rusted Gulch Territory. She asked Caleb to deliver it the next time he went to town. He didn't read it, never would without her permission, but he saw the fire in her eyes and simply nodded. "Consider it done," he said. More letters followed. To herbalists, to frontier doctors, to anyone willing to share knowledge or listen. Eliza began crafting her own prairie remedies notebook, half science, half instinct. She experimented with desert roots, thistle tea, crushed flower poultices. Caleb often found her up before dawn, scribbling notes or brewing something new in the iron pot near the fire. One afternoon, she looked at him across the porch and asked, "Would you teach me how to shoot?" He raised an eyebrow. "A gun?" "No," she said. "A bow. I don't trust loud things." He smiled, a small flicker of amusement lighting his face. "All right, then." Their lessons took place behind the cabin, under the cottonwood trees. Caleb carved a small recurve bow from ashwood and adjusted it to suit her seated posture. It was awkward at first. Her arms trembled under the weight, but she kept trying. By the end of the month, she could strike a hanging tin can from 10 yards. Why the bow? He asked one day. She didn't look up. Because no one expects a woman in a wheelchair to defend herself. He nodded solemnly. They'll learn. Word of her skills spread. More ranchers came seeking help. Coughs, wounds, infected hooves, even childbirth advice. She was especially good with children listening, not dismissing their fears. She even told stories while brewing tea, her voice steady, warm, and confident. Caleb would sit in the doorway, arms crossed, listening without seeming to. One child, a wide-eyed girl with freckles and a cough, looked up at Eliza and asked, "Were you always this smart?" Eliza laughed softly. "No, but I always wanted to be," the girl beamed. "I want to be like you when I grow up." That night, Eliza sat on the porch, the stars bright above, her notebook in her lap, and tears quietly trailing down her cheeks. And then came the gathering. The mayor of Rusted Gulch, a gruff but decent man named James Tiller, approached May House in early autumn. He removed his hat, stood awkwardly on the porch, and cleared his throat. Eliza May, he said. Town's planning a harvest meet. Women folks say they want a speaker this year, someone with real words, not just weather talk and pie recipes. She blinked. And? They want you, she stared. Me? In front of the town? In a chair? Tiller shrugged. Half the folks round here walk on bad knees and bent backs. You're the only one who talks sense. And you've done more healing than Doc Hempshaw's whiskey. She hesitated. Caleb stood nearby, silent as ever, but he gave her a small nod. Just enough. Eliza exhaled. All right then, I'll speak. The day of the harvest meet, the town square, was bustling. Bales of hay, jars of jam, and banjos playing clumsy tunes. When Eliza rolled onto the makeshift platform, a hush fell. They had all seen her before rolling quietly through town behind Caleb, or tending to the sick in silence. But this was different. She was center stage. She wore a simple green dress, wildflowers in her lap, and when she spoke, her voice rang out steady and bright. She talked of the land, of healing, of how broken things don't mean useless ones, of how strength isn't always shown through fists or legs, but through will, knowledge, and voice. She ended with this: they gave me away once because I couldn't walk. But now I roll into homes with hope in my hands. Not because I was chosen, but because I chose to fight, and so can all of you. The applause didn't erupt. It rose, slow and stunned, then stronger, then standing. Some clapped, some cried. Even old Judd Carter, hiding at the back, bowed his head. And behind the stage, arms folded, expression unreadable, stood Caleb. But his eyes glistened. And in that moment, he knew. Her voice wasn't just found. It had become the voice of the plains. Autumn passed like a golden sigh over Rusted Gulch. Leaves turned to fire. The wind softened. And at the edge of the plains, the little homestead called Mayhouse began to grow, not just in walls or fences, but in purpose. The place once mocked as a recluse's shack had become a beacon, a strange one. Yes, a place led by a paralyzed woman and a haunted cowboy, but a beacon nonetheless. It started with a garden. Eliza had always kept herbs, but now she began to dream bigger. She directed Caleb to mark out rows behind the cabin. He tilled the soil with his calloused hands and a rusty plow, turning the dry dirt into something loamy, rich, and full of promise. She planted more than just medicine. Tomatoes, beans, carrots, onions, squash, seeds from trades, gifts, and old packets dug from trunks in town. She gave each one a name, a place, and a purpose. They called it the Prairie Bloom Garden. I used to think I'd never grow anything again, she told Caleb one morning, brushing soil from her lap. Turns out, even broken roots can take hold. He didn't reply, just handed her a watering can with a small smile. Children came first. Word had spread about the woman in the chair who grew good things. They came shyly at first, brought by their mothers, some sick, some curious, others just drawn to the flowers blooming defiantly in the harsh earth. Eliza would tell them stories while they picked chamomile or helped harvest onions. She taught them how to press petals into paper, how to read the signs of fever, and how to mix peppermint and willow for headaches. The children laughed around her, laughed in ways that reminded Caleb of simpler days long buried beneath dust and gunpowder. He built benches around the garden, a swing on the old oak tree, and painted signs with the kids for each plant bed. Healing Patch, Hope Row, the Pepper Parade. It wasn't just a garden anymore. It was a sanctuary. Then came the injured animals. A rancher brought a limping calf. Eliza and Caleb fashioned a splint using birch strips and cloth. A wounded hawk was found tangled in barbed wire. Eliza cleaned its wounds with honey and vinegar, and the creature healed in a week, soaring again above the cabin like a silent guardian. I think we've started a wild hospital, Caleb joked. No, Eliza said, watching the hawk take flight. We've started a second chance. Soon. There was more work than two hands could manage. So Eliza asked the townsfolk to send those willing to learn. Teenagers tired of saloons and dust storms, widows with quiet homes, former outlaws trying to start fresh. The garden became a school, and Eliza, its firm but patient teacher. She taught medicine, farming, foraging, and courage. Caleb taught fencing, carpentry, and quiet strength. The two of them, once outcasts, had become pillars. But not everyone was pleased. Judd Carter, once the loudest voice in town, now found himself quietly ignored. His men no longer boasted about cruelty. His name was no longer respected, only tolerated. The power he once wielded through fear had been replaced by something far stronger. Kellon respect, and he hated it. They're just playing at being saints, he growled in the saloon one night. A cripple and a ghost don't get to run this town. But no one echoed him. Not anymore. One late evening, Eliza and Caleb sat on the porch, watching lanterns flicker in the wind. The garden glowed beneath the stars. Fireflies danced between corn stalks. The smell of basil and wood smoke curled in the air. I used to think I'd die on a cot, she said softly. Unseen. Unloved. Caleb looked over. And now? I think I'll live in people's stories, she whispered. In children's games, and herbs passed from one woman to another. He nodded. You already do. She turned to him, her voice suddenly quiet. Do you ever think this was supposed to happen? That we were meant to find each other? Caleb didn't answer right away, but he reached over and took her hand-rough palm over steady fingers. And in that moment, there were no jokes, no scars, no past. Just two people who had taken the worst life could give and built something beautiful. Together. The Fav Sefa. Prairie had bloomed. Not with gold or silver, not with fame or fortune, but with second chances. With a garden that healed. With a voice that rose from a wheelchair and moved mountains. With love that didn't shout, but grew rooted, deep watered by patience, lit by shared silence. The prairie was blooming. But not everyone welcomed the growth. The success of Mayhouse rippled through Rusted Gulch like a storm building in silence. Where once there had been mockery, now there was admiration. Where once folks whispered, they now openly praised Eliza May and Caleb Rourke. The wounded came to them. The lost found refuge. Even the town's children called it the Magic Garden. But some men don't like losing power. And Judd Carter was one of them. Carter stood on the balcony of his large ranch house, staring at the hills beyond the town, where Mayhouse sat like a dot on the horizon. His once loyal ranch hands had been stopping by there more and more, some bringing their families for help, others trading in town using Eliza's herbal remedies. It grated him. He'd built his reputation with fear, with bribes, threats, and quick violence. But now, a woman in a wheelchair and a ghost of a cowboy were undoing everything he'd ruled with. They're weak, he muttered to his foreman, clutching his glass of rye. She can't walk, he won't fight. That garden's made folks soft, the foreman hesitated. Maybe, but they've earned the town's ear. Carter's eyes narrowed. Then we cut it off. It began with a message. One morning, Caleb returned from town with a quiet frown. Eliza looked up from her writing desk as he stepped onto the porch. What happened? They've started rumors, he said, Carter's boys, saying you've been poisoning livestock, calling your herbs witchcraft. Eliza set her pen down carefully. They're scared. They should be, Caleb said darkly. But, Eliza shook her head. No, not of us. Of losing the version of the world where they always win. The next night, they found the chicken coop torched. The birds had escaped, but the structure was gone, blackened, smoldering. Caleb scanned the nearby trees, jaw tight. There were boot prints in the dirt, too many to count. Eliza wheeled forward, stopping beside the ashes. I won't stop healing, she said. I won't stop protecting you, Caleb replied, and with that, the silent pact between them deepened again, not just to live, not just to grow, but to stand their ground. A few days later, while tending to a feverish child inside the cabin, Eliza heard Caleb's voice call sharply from outside. Eliza inside. Now. She wheeled quickly to the doorway and froze. 4 riders had come up the path. Rough men, guns on hips, faces shadowed by hats. One of them, Harlan Briggs, was Carter's top enforcer. The others were known drifters, more dangerous with whiskey in their veins than bullets in their chambers. We ain't here to shoot, Rourke, Briggs said, holding up a gloved hand. Just here to warn. Caleb stood between them and the door, rifle slung but not raised. You've been warned, he said back. Twice, Briggs sneered. This place is changing folks, making them soft. We like Rusted Gulch tough. Hard men, quiet women. Then maybe it's time for new men, Eliza called from behind him. Briggs' eyes narrowed. You forget your place, cripple. Caleb's rifle clicked cocked and steady. Briggs chuckled and turned his horse. Careful now. Things that bloom fast, burn faster. They rode off, but the message had been delivered. That night, the wind blew harsh. Caleb stayed awake on the porch, rifle across his knees. Eliza watched from the window, her heart heavy not with fear, but resolve. We've come too far, she whispered, and they've underestimated us. She wheeled to the bookshelf, pulled out her medicine logs, and started copying them page by page. What are you doing? Caleb asked when he came inside before dawn, preparing. In case they try to burn more than chickens. The next week brought a cold, tension to the town. More windows were broken at May House. Eliza's garden was trampled in places, her chamomile patch destroyed, herbs ripped out by hand. But something unexpected happened. People stood up. A widow. From the South Ranch brought cuttings to replant the garden. 3 boys who once mocked. Eliza came to help rebuild the coop. A woman baked a loaf of bread and left a note. You helped my child breathe. We won't forget. One by one, the townsfolk who once laughed at them began to defend them. Still, Carter wasn't done. He was planning something darker, something final. He'd underestimated Caleb before, and now he was about to make the mistake of underestimating Eliza. Late that night, Eliza sat at the desk, the wind battering the windows. Caleb stood watch by the door. You know it's coming, she said. He nodded. He wants to destroy everything we built. We won't let him, she said. Her voice was steady as stone. He brought war to my body. Now he's bringing it to my home. But I'm not the same woman who came here in a cart. Caleb looked over, eyes hard and full of something deeper than anger. Then let's show him what happens when you back 2 broken things into a corner. The prairie was no longer quiet. Trouble had arrived, but so had resistance. And for the first time in years, Rusted Gulch would learn a lesson it had long forgotten. Some roots grow deepest in the harshest soil, and some people don't need to walk to stand tall. The days grew colder, and so did the town's silence. A tension clung to Rusted Gulch like a storm before the lightning, visible in the wary glances of merchants, in the hurried pace of farmers, in the sudden quiet when Caleb Rourke walked by. Everyone knew it. Carter was preparing for something, and Caleb and Eliza were preparing for him. Inside May House, the rhythm of life continued, but sharpened. Caleb began reinforcing the cabin's doors and windows. He added metal braces to the shutters, placed hidden tools around the garden. Axes. In flour barrels, horseshoes sharpened into traps beneath the hay. Not because he wanted a fight, but because he expected one. He showed the townsfolk how to use signal fires. He left messages tucked in barns for Allah's quiet, coded notes like, "If smoke rises, come armed, not for war, but for truth." Meanwhile, Eliza planned differently. While Caleb strengthened the outside, she fortified the inside, gathering every herbal remedy, tincture, and painkiller she had ever made. "If they come to hurt," she told him one night, "they'll find a healer." Waiting. And then, just before dawn on a moonless morning, it happened. Caleb was on the porch when he saw it. A flicker of torchlight on the far side of the garden. 3 riders. No. 4. No-6. More emerged from the trees. Rough men. Guns slung, faces. Masked with kerchiefs, all of them walking toward the cabin with one thing in their eyes, intent. Caleb turned without panic. "They're here." Eliza, already awake, nodded. She wheeled to the cabinet and took out a small tin box. Inside, matches, letters, and a folded map of the town with red marks where friends lived. "If something happens," she began, "then we fight smarter." He interrupted. He kneeled beside her and pressed his forehead gently to hers. "No running this time," he whispered. "We hold." The knock on the door wasn't a knock at all. It was a boot. Crack. The wood groaned. Caleb held his rifle steady as the door splintered. And then bang. He fired, a warning shot into the air. "Next one isn't a warning," he growled. From outside, a voice snarled, "Come out, Rourke. Send the witch out and no one gets hurt." Inside, Eliza's eyes sparked like flint. "Funny," she said loudly, "that you call me a witch, yet you're the one scared of a woman in a chair." The men paused. And then came a second bang. This time from outside. Gunfire. They weren't bluffing, but neither was she. "Now," Eliza said. "Signal." Caleb struck the match, lit the old oil rag, and threw it into the air above the chimney. A pillar of smoke burst upward thick, dark, unmistakable. Miles away, in the hills and barns of Rusted Gulch, people saw it. Farmhands dropped their tools. Mothers locked their doors. A few men strapped on old pistols they swore they'd never use again, and they rode. Back at May House, the first thug climbed through the side window, only to find himself tangled in tripwire and knocked unconscious by an iron skillet swinging. From the ceiling, a second burst through the back, met instantly by Caleb's boot to the chest, followed by a crack of wood across the face. At the front, Eliza wheeled to the doorway with a jar in hand. She lobbed it outside. The glass shattered. Pepper, oil, cayenne, mustard gas mix. The men howled, coughing, blinded. They weren't fighting a frail woman and a tired cowboy anymore. They were fighting a fortress built of pain and patience. And then the sound of hooves. From the south and east and north, they came dozens of townsfolk. Riders from every edge of Rusted Gulch. Women with pitchforks. Old war veterans with rifles. Boys with slingshots. They came not for revenge, but for justice. Judd Carter's men turned faces pale. Beneath their masks, "This ain't what we were told. It's just a cripple and a—" But the townsfolk had seen enough. And suddenly, Carter's army didn't feel like an army at all. The final fight was short. Carter himself arrived too late, riding in like a storm, only to find his men scattered, arrested, or held at gunpoint by the very people he once ruled. He tried to speak, to bargain, to threaten, but Eliza wheeled forward, eyes level with his saddle, and said calmly, "You ruled with fear. We led with hope. And now Rusted Gulch has decided which one they want." For once, Judd Carter had no answer. And by sundown, he was riding out of town alone. That night, the town lit lanterns from one porch to the next. Caleb and Eliza sat quietly, as people sang in the garden, laughing between songs. The wounded were tended, fences rebuilt, fires doused. It wasn't victory they celebrated. It was freedom, and a home worth defending. Morning came with a hush unlike any Rusted Gulch had ever known. For the first time in years, there was no fear in the wind, no booted shadows creeping near the saloon, no riders passing in judgment, their spurs clinking like cuffs, just golden light, spilling over Mayhouse, warm and quiet, like the land itself was holding its breath, watching a new chapter begin. The town gathered at sunrise in front of the old courthouse. It had once been Judd Carter's pride, a place of crook deals, paid-off deputies, and whispered threats. But this morning there was no Carter. There was only Eliza, sitting tall in her wheelchair at the center of the crowd, a blue shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and Caleb, standing behind her with his arms crossed and boots dusty from the night's battle. Mayor Hargrove, a worn but honest man, stepped forward with a crumpled hat in hand. He cleared his throat. "We've been under shadows for a long time," he said slowly. "But when that smoke rose last night, we didn't just see trouble, we saw a chance to be better." He turned to Eliza. "You gave us that chance." Eliza glanced down, her fingers playing with the embroidered hem of her shawl. "I didn't do it alone," she said softly. "None of us did?" She looked out at the crowd, at the women who had brought herbs to her door, the children who had learned to plant in her garden, the ranch hands who had come running the moment she lit the fire. "We believed in each other. That's what saved us." There was a silence. Then Caleb stepped forward, his voice deep and clear. "This town doesn't need a ruler," he said. "It needs leaders, many, not just one voice but many hands working together." He pulled a rolled parchment from his coat and unwrapped it on a nearby barrel. On it was a new town charter, drafted with help from the school teacher and 2 retired clerks. It laid out rules, fair ones: voting rights, land rights, limits on violence, open council seats, education for children, shared water access. Not just a town, a community. They called for a vote that very afternoon. By sundown, the people had chosen a council of 5, a rancher, a teacher, a blacksmith, a healer, and Eliza May. Caleb declined a seat, but he promised to stay on as town protector, not a sheriff, but a peacekeeper. "I've worn too many badges that meant too little," he said. "Now I just want to protect what matters." In the weeks that followed, Rusted Gulch transformed. The saloon was cleaned up and turned into a meeting hall. Carter's old mansion became a school and infirmary, with Eliza training a new generation of healers, boys and girls alike. Caleb repaired the old rail post and reopened a mail route connecting the town to others for the first time in years. Letters began flowing. Supplies, books, hope. They even renamed the town's heart, the dry, dusty square where Carter once barked orders. They called it the Bloom, in honor of the garden that started it all. One chilly morning, Eliza sat beneath the old oak tree, wrapped in wool and watching the children play. A girl was running with a bandaged lamb. 2 boys were trying to teach a goat to pull a wagon. Laughter spilled through the wind like music. Caleb approached, carrying a mug of tea and a small wrapped box. "For you," he said. Eliza arched a brow. "What's the occasion?" He smiled. "You'll see." She unwrapped the box slowly. Inside, a silver brooch, delicately crafted in the shape of a blooming prairie flower, petals stretched wide. "I had it made by the blacksmith's wife," he said. "She said it reminded her of the garden. And of you." Eliza looked down at it, touched. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Caleb hesitated. "Eliza," he said softly, "I've been thinking. Maybe someday, when you're ready, maybe this house of ours doesn't have to be just a refuge." She turned toward him, eyes glimmering. "Are you proposing?" He laughed, a deep, weathered sound. "Not yet. Just planting a seed." She smiled, tucking the brooch close to her heart. "Well," she said, "you've always had a gift for growing things." That night, The town gathered once more under lanterns, under stars. There was music, dancing, laughter. No fear. No smoke. Just peace. A new dawn. One born not of war, but of resilience, not of wealth, but of faith. And at the center of it all sat a woman once forgotten, and a man once lost, now found in each other, and in the home they helped build together. Years passed. Seasons rolled over the plains like songs carried by the wind. Dry summers that made the earth crack. Soft winters that turned the town silver and still. And through it all, Rusted Gulch stood tall, not as a place ruled by gold or guns, but by something rarer out west. Kalon hoped. The old saloon still held laughter, but now it was the kind born from stories and music, not the slamming of fists or the crack of bottles. The schoolhouse rang with the voices of children who had never known Judd Carter's reign. And just beyond the edge of town, nestled among the wildflowers and wind-carved fences, stood May House, its garden more lush than ever, its soil a testament to every pain turned into purpose. Inside, Eliza sat at her desk. Quill in hand, she wrote slowly now. Her fingers were stiffer with age, but her mind remained sharp as a prairie thorn. The book before her was nearly full of memoir, she called it. Not about me, she often said with a wink, but about what's possible. Every chapter chronicled the town's transformation, the battles, the victories, the lessons learned. She wrote of a woman no one believed in, and a man who had once stopped believing in himself. She wrote of a place made strong not by perfection, but by courage, connection, and change. Outside, Caleb was helping two young boys fix a broken wagon. Wheel. His beard had silvered at the edges, and the limp in his step had become more pronounced. But his eyes still held that watchful calm, that fire ready to rise when the town needed it. He didn't speak much these days. He didn't have to. His story was in the fences he mended, the trails he kept clear, the way children ran to him like he was a part of the land itself. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and bathed the town in gold, the town council gathered to make an announcement. The school teacher stood before the community with a proud smile. Today, we finish carving the names into the foundation stone beneath the courthouse. The names of those who rebuilt Rusted Gulch after the dark years. She turned, gesturing to the newest etchings. Eliza May, the heart who healed us. Caleb Rourke, the shield who stood. A cheer rose from the crowd, but Caleb and Eliza exchanged. Only a small glance warm, knowing. They hadn't done it for the glory. They'd done it so the next child rolling into town in a chair, or the next loner with a worn hat and a quiet soul, would know they belonged. Years later, travelers passing through the West would stop in Rusted Gulch and hear tales of the woman who healed outlaws and orphans, the cowboy who stopped a war with one shot in the air, the garden that bloomed through drought and fear. Children would sit around fires, wide-eyed, as elders told the legend. She couldn't walk and he couldn't rest. But together, they made the town breathe again. Some called it a fairy tale. Some said it was embellished, but every time someone doubted, someone else would point to the bronze statue standing in the bloom. Two figures, one in a weathered hat, one in a wheelchair with a flower in hand, their hands nearly touching, but reaching, always reaching. Together. As time went on, the May House became a sanctuary for travelers, poets, and wayfarers. A place where outcasts were welcomed, not whispered about. A place where every person, no matter their burden, was told, "There's room here, grow something." Eliza's book was eventually published under the title, The Garden and the Gun, what we chose instead. It found its way across states, territories, and oceans. Some called it a Western. Others called it a guide for rebuilding. Eliza just called it a letter to the next person who feels forgotten. In the final pages, she wrote, "We weren't heroes. We were just tired of being afraid. And one day, that tiredness turned into something louder than fear. I couldn't walk, but I could still grow. Caleb couldn't stay still, but he learned to belong, and the town was broken, but it was listening. That's all we needed. And that's how they were remembered, not as legends in shining hats or saints in clean boots, but as two ordinary souls who refused to let the wildness of the West steal their goodness, the cowboy and the woman. No one believed and had defied the odds, but more importantly, they made it easier for others to believe in themselves.